Well, thank you, Todd. Thank you for the musicians and stuff that have led us this morning. That was just great. Well, my name is Todd Misfeldt, and I'm one of the pastors here. Get my technology going here for a second. And we're in the middle of a sermon series in which we're following Jesus down the road that he leads us to in Mark. And today we make a stop on this road that leads to Jesus' suffering, crucifixion, and death. And the stop is at the Garden of Gethsemane. And you can see where we are, week 10, we're in the garden. And one part of Jesus' stop in the garden that strikes me is the importance that the gospel writer of Mark puts on relationships. There is a relationship between Jesus and his disciples, and there's also a relationship between Jesus and the Father. So with the gospel, we have to ask, how does that apply to us? What is our relationship with Jesus? And what is our relationship with God? Now, I don't know about you, but my relationships in general, my view of relationships have changed over the years. As a baby or infant, we're very self-centered, right? If we're hungry, we cry. If we need a change, we cry. But eventually, as we grow older, we begin to realize that there are other people in the world where we're not alone. And we also begin to realize that, hey, that companionship of having someone else around gives us comfort. And we even get to know that we enjoy having them around, especially if we've had a tough day. Well, I remember a time in my youth that illustrates this. Now, my parents were divorced when I was 8 years old. And I don't remember a lot of what happened at that time, but I do know there was a lot of yelling going on in the house. And I recall one time I wanted to play with my best friend, Dean was his name, and so I called him on the turkey farm. And so I had to call first because we lived on a turkey farm, and so the next houses over were a little bit away, not too far. And I remember talking to Dean and telling him that we could play at his house or my house, but if he came to my house, he would have to bring some earmuffs with him because there was so much yelling. Now, for those of you who grew up in warm climates, earmuffs are things that you wear on your head to keep your ears warm. We did not have noise-canceling headphones back then, not at all. Well, the conflict between my parents distressed me, and I wanted the comfort of a friend to be with. Now, in Jesus' journey to the garden, we see some of what I experienced on that turkey farm a long, long time ago. Well, let's see what... in the garden, Jesus seeks comfort from the relationships that we talked about. And so let's see what Jesus' time in the garden can teach us about relationships that we encounter in our journey. So please stand for today's reading. And I've asked Tim Lowe to read from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verses 27 to 50. It should be on.
Verse 27. You will all fall away, Jesus told them, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. Excuse me. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Peter declared, even if all fall away, I will not. Truly I tell you, Jesus answered, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the others said the same. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, he said to them. Stay here and keep watch. Going a little further, he fell to the ground and prayed that, if possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. Returning the third time, he said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Enough, the hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. Just as he was speaking, Jesus, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. Then everyone deserted him and fled.
Thank you, Tim. Please be seated. So please join me in prayer. Dear Jesus, it pains us to see the burden that you are carrying in the Garden of Gethsemane. It pains us to see your disciples abandon you. We acknowledge, Jesus, that in the past, we have been no better than the disciples, and that at times we too have fled from you. Forgive us. Send the Holy Spirit to strengthen our relationship with you. And we pray that we may never abandon you again. And we thank you that despite our weakness, that you still love us. Amen. Thank you. The first relationship that I want to look at in the garden is that as with Jesus, our leader. And when a group of people lose their leader, there is usually chaos. And in the case of disciples, this chaos is predicted by Jesus, starting in verse 27. You will all fall away, Jesus told them, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will scatter. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. But Peter declared, even if all fall away, I will not. Jesus often uses the shepherd-sheep analogy when speaking of himself and his followers. And Jesus knew that a life and death situation was about to happen. And he knew that all of his closest friends would flee from him. They would all fall away. Now, when the disciples hear Jesus' prediction, what do? They react. They react with their heart and start to deny it. In fact, they don't even hear the positive part of what Jesus said, that he will precede them into Galilee. If they had been listening, they would have asked, risen? What? When? That's an important part of what Jesus is saying there. But they were not listening. And like us, our spirit is willing, but the flesh is sometimes weak. And we can get tripped up by the habits of the flesh and the gut reaction we have sometimes. But they pledged to Jesus in verse 31, but Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the other disciples did the same. So they failed. But If you look at yourself, do we do any better than that? Like the disciples, Jesus is our shepherd, our leader. We follow him. We're following him on this road through Mark. And if someone told us that we were going to deny Jesus, I'm sure most of us would say, no, I'm never going to deny Jesus. Sound familiar? But like Jesus knows that his disciples are going to be tested. And we too should know from their example that we too are going to be tested. Now, our faith can be tested, can fail for any number of different reasons. And one of those reasons seen here is that we don't expect to be tested. And it catches us by surprise, like the mob at the end of the passage with the disciples. Now, being tested is not a fun experience. But, maybe does anyone here like to be tested? I don't see anyone. If there was someone, I would say, bless you. That's a good thing to know. Now, for over 30 years, I was a software developer. And so you write software, and your work gets tested. That's part of the job. Because writing software is a pretty complicated task. You've got any number of inputs coming in. You've got a lot of events you have to account for. And I enjoyed the challenge, and I thought I was pretty good at it myself. But you learn that you have to test your code because it's not perfect. And if you don't test it, it's not going to work, and you release buggy code. Well, so you have it tested. Do you think that testing ever finds mistakes? Oh, yeah, all the time. And the testing makes the product better. It makes it fulfill its specifications. It makes it more valuable. It ensures that product lives up to its design, its purpose. So as a software developer, as I matured, I expected my work to be tested and to rework it, to fix it, to make it what it should be. What about our relationship with Jesus, our leader? Will our relationship be tested like my software was? Well, if you think about it, yes, it will be. Our relationship, when it's tested, it's called temptation. That's kind of the Christianese word we use for that. Now, in my own life, I can look back and I see when I was tested, as I transitioned from being a teen to an independent adult, from those college years, and after you get out, you've got your first job and you're on top of the world usually. Well, going from an obedient Christian in high school, my disappointment with the church leaders I found in college made me fall away from Jesus. I turned my back. In a lot of ways, I fell away like the disciples did in the garden when faced with an armed mob. Well, the good news is that the disciples did reconnect with Jesus, his prediction that he would meet them again in Galilee, and they were made stronger by that testing. And I too was made stronger after I reconnected with Jesus, after I returned to him. And my faith was deeper and stronger, just like that software I would write. Well, Jesus knows we're going to be tested. And when Jesus makes this prediction, he says that I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. This is actually a reference to an Old Testament passage from Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7. And if you look at that larger passage, it says that we will be tested and we will be refined and we will grow closer to God. What's true of software development was true of the disciples, and it's true of us. We will be tested by temptation, and we should expect to be tested. And when we are tested, we should not be surprised like, why is God testing me? But rather we should look at it and say, this is a test. If I pass the test, I will become stronger in my faith, and I will emerge stronger from it, and I will be a better follower of Jesus. That's a valuable lesson for us. But that's not the only lesson here, because there's another relationship that we see with Jesus in the garden. A relationship in which friends can provide comfort when we are in pain. We see Jesus in pain when he goes to the garden. The foreknowledge of what is about to happen to him is a great burden on him. And when we too are in pain, sometimes all we want is a friend to be with us. Their presence can comfort us. In verse 34, Jesus took his closest friends, Peter, James, and John, along with him. And he says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." I can relate to that. Can you, if you've been in, a world of hurt at times? I remember a time in junior high school when my friends and I were wrestling with these new feelings that you get, in that age. And my best friend, Tom, and I would go for bike rides. And we would just ride around the neighborhood, would ride to some of the schools and stuff, just kind of meandering around. And we would talk about our feelings, mostly about the girls we thought were cute. Now, I can't remember any of the words, but I do remember that in our teenage angst and surging hormones and doubts about the world around us, that just the presence of Tom was very comforting. And that's what Jesus was after when he brought his disciples with him, and in particular, his closest disciples. He wanted that comfort of his closest friends with him. Now, for us, being present with someone is not always their default behavior. If a friend is hurting or has a problem, we, maybe mostly men, I don't know, can immediately drop into problem-solving mode, right? I suffer from this. If sitting in silence with a friend can be uncomfortable. And in my relationship with my wife, Celeste, who's down here, she can testify to this. If I hear her talk about a problem that she is having, I immediately start thinking about how to solve a problem. I stop listening at that point. But sometimes this is not what she wants. She just wants someone to listen to her and to give her comfort. And for me, that's kind of hard to tell. And sometimes I have to be kind of dumb and just say, Celeste, do you want help solving your problem, or do you just want me to listen? If I don't pause and do that, I get in trouble, and I'll get a reaction like, well, you're not listening to me. Has this ever happened to anyone here? All right, good. Oh, thank you. I'm not alone. Listening in silence can be hard, can it? And in fact, I'm going to challenge you. I heard a lot of laughing. Let's try this right now. So what I have in mind is turn to your neighbor and tell them about a situation in your life that is bothering you. And this could be as simple as maybe someone cut you off in traffic this morning, or maybe you had a bad experience shopping in a store. So take turns. One person tells them their problem, the other person listens. Maybe there's only a little or something to acknowledge that you're there. And then trade and do it with the other person. All right, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, so why don't you do that right now, okay? So how did that feel? Did it feel good to have someone listen to you without them immediately jumping in with something else? I tell you, from up here, I saw some very interesting body language. There was like this, and there were also the hugs too, and the people looking off into the ceiling. And anyway, watching people is fascinating, but that's not the topic that we're dealing with here. But my hope was that you felt comforted when someone was just listening to you. In the garden, Jesus seeks comfort from his relationship with his disciples, and so too with his Father in heaven. And relationships are to the very core of God's nature. If you haven't thought about this, consider it. That when we see this all over the Bible, when Jesus gives us the greatest commandment, what is it? To love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. To love someone means you're in a relationship with them. And love is God's motivation for his actions in the Bible. How does that one verse go again? John 3:16? For God so loved the world that he gave his own one and only Son. Starts off with love and a relationship. Sin, however, destroys that relationship with God. And restoring sin is the sin that gets between us and God is, in fact, the story of the Bible. That's what Jesus does. He repairs a relationship to God, so there's nothing to prevent us from being in that relationship. Now, looking again at the passage, Jesus seeks comfort with the Father through prayer. Verse 35, going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. When Jesus prays to let this hour pass from him, he's referring to the events of his arrest, that his arrest will lead to, his suffering, crucifixion, and death. And the cup represents a sense of one's destiny, both in good and bad senses, but mostly for death in general. And drinking from the cup is accepting its contents, Jesus' destiny. Oh, Jesus does not turn away from his destiny, what's in front of him. He's in anguish about it, but he trusts the Father. He accepts the Father's will and comfort. Now, yielding to someone else's will, as Jesus did, is a hard thing for some of us to do. And for me, it was a hard thing to do at one time. I remember after college, as I said, I was pretty cocky. I thought I knew everything. And I wouldn't yield to anyone else's will unless I absolutely had to, or maybe it gave me something in the future that I would enjoy. I remember one time when I was working for Hewlett-Packard in Palo Alto, I was upset with something at work, and my anger apparently showed. My boss, Ted, called me aside and said, "What are you angry about?" Now, I didn't want to tell him, so I said, "Oh, I have the right to be angry." Well, Ted pulled rank and made me explain what my anger was about. But I was still self-centered at that point, and I did not want to yield, and I yielded reluctantly to my boss. Well, I've changed since then. I'm now more easily yield my will. Part of that change is, as I've grown in experience, I've realized that I don't know as much as I used to know. Thank you for that, yes. But the other part is that my relationship with God has grown. I mean, when I was young, yeah, I would yield to God, but not all the time. I have to confess that. But I have grown to trust God more when you're in a relationship with someone, you get a history with them. You learn that if you trust them, they come through. And I've learned that with God. And in fact, I kind of laugh at it sometimes, that I think I have control over something. And in seminary, when I used to do it, I would want my life to be planned out. I had my 3-year plan, my 5-year plan, my 10-year plan. Whenever I did that in seminary, I would feel this curtain coming down over my eyes. And the lesson from that was you have to trust God. You have to yield your will to God. Now, when we are young, if we have loving parents, they give us directions that we are wise to listen to. Don't touch that hot stove, for instance. And when we are in middle age, our friends can see things that we may be blind to, and they may give us advice like, don't date that person, they're bad for you. That saves us a lot of hurt and angst in the long run if we listen to them. And when we get older, our wise children can tell us how we can live better and be safer. And this might be something like, well, it's time to stop driving or get medical attention. Now, I'm not yet to the point where the kids have asked for the keys to the car, but there are many times when I have to yield to others now, much more so than I ever envisioned in the past. Now, sometimes we know there are tough decisions ahead of us, and we can yield to God on that or yield to our friends' advice. But other times they appear suddenly, like that crowd coming out of the darkness and confronting Jesus and the disciples. Now, in my position here of pastor of care and discipleship, I often feel that I can't control very much, tell you the truth, especially my time. I've discovered that every day I have to give up my will, surrender it to God, and deal with what he puts in front of me at that moment. And you know what? Things work out. It's magic the way it works out. And when you trust God, that's the experience that you get. Whether it's tithing more than you think you should or volunteering more, God provides. And as I said, it seems like magic sometimes, but it's not magic. It's being open to what God is doing around me and around you. How God is inviting me into his plans at that moment. If you give up control, give it all to God, I find it's more peaceful than actually being in control of everything. It is a blessing. Well, I mentioned that my feelings towards relationships have changed over the years. I've changed from being a rather selfish in my youth and never yielding to anyone, even to God's will daily. And like Jesus demonstrates in the garden, I've learned to get comfort from God and those around me. I pray and I yield my will to God. In some ways, I live in my own Garden of Gethsemane every day. So that's my testimony. What about you? How will you react when you go into your own Garden of Gethsemane? Perhaps your hour is in front of you right now. You're facing something. Perhaps it's a little ways off. Perhaps it's hiding around the corner and will surprise you in a moment. Learn from Jesus in Gethsemane. React to a new burden, not out of surprise of its sudden appearance, but with the realization that this is a test. And that if you take effort past the test, that your faith will be stronger. And you don't need to deal with it alone. You have friends. You have God who will be with you in prayer. So release your burdens to God through prayer. Yield to his will, and you will be comforted. Well, at the end of my message this morning, at the end of this passage, this stop at week 10 in the garden, Jesus continues along this road to the cross. Now, when he came to the garden, he was with his disciples. He had companionship. But now Jesus walks alone because he's on his mission out of his love for us. We'll come back next week to see what the next stop on the road to the cross leads. Thank you.
Thank you so much for worshiping with us today. We want to invite you, would you like prayer? We have a team right over here, and they'll pray for you about anything on your heart. You can come and they'll pray for you. Again, if any of you are new, we would love to have you join us. We have a Taste and See tour. I'll be right over here. I'll take you on a tour of the church. We'd just love to get to know you a little bit. And we also have other ways in which you can engage and respond. You can hit that QR code, and there's ways that you can grow by connecting to a life group or a class. We'll connect you with that. You can give to support the ministry of this church. You can also volunteer your time and serve. So for any of those things, you can, again, click that QR code, and we'll get back in touch with you. Todd, there's a certain part of your sermon where a lot of husbands got little elbows from their wives. And,
you never know. It could go the other way, too.
It could go. It could go. So thank you so much for your words. We're hoping you can just offer the benediction.
Sure. And I would like to challenge you to grow in your relationship with your neighbor by giving someone the gift of your presence this week. And secondly, to grow in yielding to God, yielding to the Father. So I challenge you this week to do one of those two things as a way to grow your relationships. So now I'm going to paraphrase the St. Patrick's thing that, may God go before you. May God be behind you. May he be on your right and your left. May he be with you when you lay down. May he be with you when you stand up. But may he always, always be with you. Go in peace.